listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, it was one of Australia's most brutal triple murders. A son convicted of stabbing his parents and also his sister to death at their home in Sydney in 2001. Now, more than 20 years later, the killer, Sef Gonzales, has won the right to appeal his life sentence after new evidence of his post-traumatic stress emerged. We'll unpack whether he will walk free and if the decision may set a dangerous precedent. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Thursday, the 28th of August. Victoria Police have appealed for the public's help as the search for alleged police killer Dezi Freeman continues. They've warned if any member sees the offender, they should not approach him as he is armed and dangerous and should call 000 immediately. Updating the media in a special news conference today, Deputy Commissioner Russell Barrett said their operation to find Dezi Freeman is stepping up.
Community up here will see, and across the state will see, a significant escalation in policing activity. That shouldn't be unexpected. That's what we're about. We're focused on our purpose, to apprehend the offender and bring him before the courts.
Police also addressed Freeman directly, urging him to call 000 with the offer of a surrender plan. Federal MP Bob Katter has threatened a journalist at a news conference in Brisbane. Speaking outside Brisbane Parliament about his decision to attend this weekend's anti-migration rally, Channel 9 journalist Josh Bavas asked Mr Katter about his Lebanese heritage. Mr Katter had this to say in response.
Oh, mate, don't say that, because that irritates me and I punch blokes in the mouth for saying that. Don't you dare say that. My family have been in this country for 140 years, right? So if you say anything like that, I have, on many occasions, punched blokes in the mouth, right? So I'm restraining myself today. Don't say it. I'm not listening to you. You're out.
And you can see the vision of that confrontation on our Instagram page. And Qantas has delivered a bumper profit of $2.4 billion. That's up 15% on last year. The airline says strong travel demand helped push passenger revenue to $20.4 billion. Shareholders will receive a final dividend of 16.5 cents per share, plus a special dividend of 9.9 cents. The result comes after Qantas was fined $90 million over illegally sacking more than 1,800 workers. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with criminal psychologist Tim Watson-Munro on the latest bid by one of Australia's worst mass murderers to appeal his sentence. In 2001, Sef Gonzales brutally murdered his mother, father and sister by stabbing them to death in their Sydney home. He was convicted and sentenced to life behind bars without parole. Now, that may change after Sef won the right to appeal that sentence because of new claims he suffers post-traumatic stress disorder after being abused as a child. So what are Sef's chances of winning this latest court fight, and could one of Australia's most cold-blooded killers walk free? Tim, thanks so much for joining us. We know that triple murderer Sef Gonzales was actually convicted for this horrific crime involving his family. Can you just recap what he was actually convicted and jailed for doing?
He murdered his parents and his sister. The Crown alleged that the motive was money. He stood to inherit a property, I think, valued at about $1.5 million at the time. It went to trial, and he was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, for which he was given life without the prospect of parole. So as far as the court was concerned, the sentencing judge was concerned, Sef would spend the rest of his life behind stone walls and iron bars. But he has appealed this on 5 separate occasions, and on each occasion the appeal has been rejected. So he was first apprehended on the 13th of June 2002. He was about, I think, 21 years of age at the time. He was very young. He spent more than half of his life now in prison. So it's an extraordinary case, and now that he's been given leave to appeal, I presume the appeal is on the severity, not the conviction. So they would be looking for, I assume, to have a non-parole period fixed, which might give him some hope of getting out at some point.
You mentioned before, Tim, that as we know, Gonzales has appealed and failed 5 times in his attempts to overturn his convictions. But now a judge this week has allowed him to challenge the jail term handed down because of evidence of his PTSD. Now, exactly, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. What chance does that have on then allowing him to appeal this?
Look, I think that's in the hands of the court. My understanding is that way back when he was psychiatrically and psychologically evaluated, the issue of PTSD was raised, but Mr. Gonzales stated that he didn't have any of those symptoms. He was in a state of denial, they're now saying, and that with the effluxion of time, he recognises that clearly he was suffering PTSD or the symptoms of PTSD arising from an alleged sexual assault by a priest when he was about 10 years of age. I think, reading between the lines, and I've not read the decision, the argument is, well, look, if that evidence had been admitted on the basis of him talking about the symptoms, it may well have been a mitigating factor in terms of the harsh sentence that was handed down. Given his age, I've not examined this man, so I don't know what happened with the priest. I don't know if he had any treatment. It would seem that he had none. It would seem that he was in denial about the treatment. And the judge stated, look, over the last 2 decades, there's been greater understanding and knowledge regarding PTSD, and the fact that in particular, and I can vouch for this in some ways. I've seen many, many people who have been sexually abused by many different types of people, including the clergy over the years. A lot of them are in denial because they don't want to talk about it. Their way of coping with their symptoms is to completely suppress them and to completely suppress the memories of what occurred. It seems to me that there's an acceptance that this may have been the case with Sef Gonzales, and now that he's talking about the symptoms, let's have another look at. But as you say, he's got to be granted leave to appeal. He's got the first door open, but it's not a lay down misère that they'll even hear this case. I wouldn't want to preempt it or prejudge it, but that's the state of play as I understand it today.
How common is now this situation regarding post-traumatic stress disorder? Because we do know there are horrific consequences of abuse either by the clergy or by someone they know, and that may reappear years and years later. From your professional experience, how does that play out for the survivors?
Well, it's real. One of the things that I did decades ago, I set up the first trauma debriefing company in Australia, and we had contracts with the major banks, the National Bank, Westpac, and the ANZ and so on. And the point of that is that back then, the banks were starting to realise that individuals who'd been subject to an armed robbery developed symptoms that were very real for them. And so the recognition of PTSD started to evolve from that point, probably in the mid-80s. People started doing PhDs on it and so on. But it's been around forever. I mean, World War I, it was described as war nerves. So people on the front line, they confronted death and battle. They would have conversion hysterias, their legs wouldn't work. They were often branded as cowards, and some of them were shot. There was no real recognition of the strong psychological impact that exposure to trauma can have. But certainly over the last 40 years or so, there's been a gradual evolution in the understanding of this condition. It's a diagnosable condition, and it's real. And the symptoms, there's a whole spectrum of symptoms, but it has to be a major trauma. The symptoms have to prevail. People often develop hypervigilance to danger, so they're very edgy all the time. They find it very difficult to trust people. They suffer depression, flashbacks, nightmares. Their self-esteem is inevitably impacted in a negative way, and quite often arising from those symptoms, if they're not effectively recognised and treated, people can drift along a path of substance use. alcohol, cocaine, ice. Certainly I saw quite a number of World War II veterans. They were elderly men who had been in battleships in the Mediterranean, 3 decks below the surface, with German U-boats that were floating around and sailing around, living with a constant spectre of imminent death and drowning. And those that survived came back to Australia, and, illicit drugs weren't as available then as they are now. And inevitably, these blokes were all alcoholics. They would drink themselves all day long to try and cope with their stress. So it's a very valid condition. The symptoms are real, and they are, for some, extraordinarily debilitating.
Tim, in regards to the Sef Gonzales case, we know that post-traumatic stress disorder or syndrome is absolutely real. We know lots of people suffer from it. They're more susceptible, as you mentioned, to substance abuse and also other serious issues. But one may argue they don't go out, which Sef Gonzales has been convicted of and jailed, they don't go out and murder family members. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's quite right. And I don't know what's going to be argued. He's self-represented. But I assume he'd be arguing, look, at the time, my judgment was fractured. I was young. I was immature. I haven't examined him, as I've stated, so who knows whether substance use factors into his particular equation. But I think he'd really be looking for the prerogative of mercy, saying, look, I went through this. I had these symptoms. I was in denial at the time. I now recognise the symptoms and the impact they had upon me, and that may be used as leverage to at least get him a non-parole period, because at the moment he's got life without parole. He's still a young bloke. He's in his 40s, so he's looking ahead at a lot of jail. In terms of your question, PTSD in itself may not necessarily be a mental state defence to a crime like murder. It's generally people who go along that route generally are out of touch with reality. They may suffer some sort of psychotic condition and so on. There may be an argument, I've not examined him, that because of his PTSD, his inability to cope with stress, that he became more impulsive. That may be the argument, but I think we're really just speculating as to what arguments he's going to advance to the court, if indeed he gets the opportunity to do so.
And in regards to Sef Gonzales, Tim, he has always proclaimed his innocence, but as we've mentioned on numerous occasions, he was convicted and jailed for 3 horrific murders. If by chance he does get a win in regards to the parole situation, what kind of precedent, if any, will this set for the possibility of other criminals to use post-traumatic stress disorder or syndrome as some type of excuse for what happened?
It's a good question. It's hard to say. I examined Julian Knight, who did the Hoddle Street Massacre in 1987. He was 19 years of the age, so approximal age to Sef when he committed these offences. He pleaded guilty as it eventuated, and he was given a life sentence with a minimum of 27 years. And he killed 7 people from memory and injured a lot more. He's still in jail, though, 37, 38 years on. He's still in prison. And during the course of his sentence, the government brought in legislation that's colloquially described as the Julian Knight Act, which says that he can't be considered for parole until he's either too old or too infirm to be a risk to the Australian community. We've got a more recent case that's coming up, and that is of Erin Patterson, the so-called mushroom killer. She's been convicted of murdering 3 people, the attempted murder of a 4th, a harrowing crime really by any reckoning. And the big argument is not about the life sentence. The big argument between the Crown and the defence is whether or not she should be given a non-parole period below the life sentence. And there's a lot of speculation as to if that occurs, how long would she get? I wouldn't want to preempt his honour, but the general thinking on the street is at least, probably 35 years. So to answer your question, would this be used as a precedent? I don't think he's the first person in the country that's tried to use a mental state defence as mitigation against a serious crime. Indeed, this is what I've been doing the last 47 years, is writing reports about people charged with serious crimes ahead of the sentencing proceedings to look out and tease out what dynamics may be relevant to their mental state. Not that they're crazy, because they've been found guilty, using crazy in common parlance, legally insane in a more professional way, but to look at things like substance use, PTSD, histories of sexual abuse, whether they existed, the sort of role modelling in the home. Were you raised in a violent home so you don't know any other way of problem solving? And I think every case is treated on its merits. It's hard to say, but this won't, in my view, establish a precedent. The precedents are there already.
All right, we really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much, Tim.
It's a pleasure.
That was criminal psychologist Tim Watson-Munro. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.